A voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. The Privileges Committee has published its special report on its critics, but in doing so, has it itself misled Parliament, the crime of which it accused Boris Johnson. Freedom of speech is fundamental to our parliamentary democracy, and yet the committee wants to be immune from criticism. Exclusively to State of the Nation, I will be giving my view on this report. But in good news, I'm pleased to see that the Privileges Committee has been watching GB News, like the rest of the nation. And from a quasi-judicial story to one of real judicial activism, the High Court's Rwanda ruling has been overturned by the Court of Appeal because they think Rwanda's dangerous. Can we no longer trust judges to interpret the law set by Parliament? Are they resisting the will of democracy? Another new segment comes to State of the Nation, and it makes its debut tonight. Jacob's Book Club launches today, and our first guest, Mr. Edward Chancellor, will be here to discuss his book, The Price of Time. As interest rates rocket and the effects are felt all around, we'll be asking him, should we be blaming the central banks? Plus, you've heard tonight that my fellow GB News presenter, Nigel Farage, has had his bank account closed for no obvious reason. And yet another example presents itself after Barclays is accused of caving in to LGBT activists and shutting down a Christian charity's bank account. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by a tripartite panel this evening. We're hoping Stephen Pound, who's a bit late, will get here. But also we'll have GB News senior political commentator Nigel Nelson and Daily Telegraph columnist Madeline Grant. But as ever, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's time for the all-important news with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you. Good evening. The government says it's going to challenge the ruling by the Court of Appeal that the Rwanda asylum policy is unlawful. Judges say sending asylum seekers to Rwanda will be unlawful unless and until the deficiencies in its government's asylum processes are corrected. The Prime Minister says he fundamentally disagrees with the decision, with the Home Secretary saying she remains fully committed despite the legal setback. Suella Braverman also suggested the current system was rigged against the British people, insisting, however, she still had every confidence in the plan.
Fair, Mr. Speaker, on people and our partners in the developing world, that we in the West continue to maintain an asylum seeker system so open to abuse that it incentivises mass flows of economic migration into Europe, lining the pockets of people smugglers and turning our seas into graveyards, all in the name of a phony humanitarianism.
Thames Water has appointed a new chair today amid pressures the company faces concerning its finances. So Adrian Montague, previously chair of Anglian Water, will take over the role on July the 10th and is replacing Sarah Bentley. Thames Water says it's working with shareholders to secure extra funding as ministers draw up contingency plans to nationalise it in the event of a collapse. The UK's biggest water supplier is battling to service its £14 billion worth of debt following interest rate rises. As you've been hearing, Boris Johnson's allies have been criticised by the Privileges Committee for what it describes as undermining House of Commons procedures. They include Priti Patel, Nadine Dorries and Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg. The Privileges Committee report 2 weeks ago found the former Prime Minister had repeatedly misled Parliament over COVID breaches at Number 10 during lockdown. The inquiry now says MPs should consider whether their actions could be in contempt of Parliament and what further action needs to be taken. Nicola Sturgeon has been talking to the COVID-19 inquiry today and telling them that Scotland had no plan for a non-flu pandemic, and she also said that learning from the episode was of critical importance. The former First Minister was questioned this morning on how prepared Scotland was, and as well as how she was prepared as a politician in handling the pandemic. She also told the inquiry her government did its best, but admitted it didn't get everything right. The 3 Just Stop Oil protesters who invaded the pitch at Lord's Cricket Ground in London yesterday have all been charged with aggravated trespass. Judith Murray, Daniel Knorr and Jacob Bourne disrupted the second Ashes test yesterday. They'll appear at Westminster Magistrates Court next month. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and the TuneIn app. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
The Privileges Committee published its report today entitled The Coordinated Campaign of Interference in the Work of the Privileges Committee. The report lists a number of its critics and their criticisms, including me, and proposes to the House a resolution to approve its special report, specifically that members of this House should not impugn the integrity of the committee or its members, or attempt to lobby or intimidate those members, or to encourage others to do so, since such behaviour undermines the proceedings of the House and is itself capable of being a contempt. In other words, the report is seeking special protection from criticism. And this is a fundamental challenge to freedom of speech. As members of the House, we must be able to ask questions of the committee. It is not like the Standards Committee, dealing with things that people may or may not have done as a matter of fact. It is a political committee. And the committee is also potentially challenging members of the press and the public, because if MPs can't criticise, can other people? And it must be reasonable to ask, is the chairman impartial? Harriet Harman had quite clearly expressed partial views on the investigation. She failed the Hoffman test. We must be able to ask whether the rules were applied equally. Sir Bernard Jenkin is still in hiding. He refuses to deny allegations of breaching lockdown himself, and yet he thought he could sit in judgment. He must answer those questions. But why did not provide any evidence of orchestration between the critics? It makes this claim of orchestration, but I didn't need anyone to tell me about the committee's inadequacies. I didn't need anyone to encourage me to criticise it. It It was obvious that there were flaws within it, and the report itself, we know, it claimed to know what was in Boris Johnson's mind, it couldn't establish intent, it admitted anonymous witnesses who could not be cross-examined. And to go back to fundamentals, the report reminds us that in 1978 the House agreed that, in general, the House should exercise its penal jurisdiction in any event as sparingly as possible, and only when satisfied that to do so was essential in order to provide reasonable protection for the House, its members or its officers from improper obstruction or attempt at or threat of obstruction. As I said a couple of weeks ago, and I'll repeat, criticism is not obstruction. I was very careful not to speak to individual members of the committee who I knew about the work they were doing, but to criticise them publicly and openly seems to me to be perfectly fair and reasonable. And the committee does appear to be attempting to re-engineer Parliament to facilitate future political purges. Imagine for a moment that there was a political figure that the government wanted to shut up, and there was a speaker like John Bercow with a political axe to grind. That could lead to privileges inquiries which could not then be challenged or criticised, however legitimate the criticisms may be. What if that then proposed a sanction exceeding the 10-day threshold, potentially triggering a by-election of the said leader of a different view within Parliament, and then claimed immunity from criticism, in some cases in this subsidiary report, even after the investigation was finalised? Bear in mind, there is no appeal outside Parliament. Under the Bill of Rights, no court outside Parliament can consider what Parliament decides, so the committee's decision would be absolute. In my view, the House of Commons is overreaching itself as it did in the past when it didn't like John Juna, then at the Sunday Express, reporting on MPs supposedly fiddling their petrol coupons when petrol was rationed. They summoned him to the bar of the House, and who looked silly? The House, not John Juna. This report isn't self-muddled. It doesn't seem to know the difference between Conservative Post and the Conservative Democratic Organisation. And the Privileges Committee members, well, they're all too ashamed to defend the report. We asked all 7 of them onto this programme, but they're all afraid to come in. Harriet Harman, perhaps not surprisingly, said no. Bernard Jenkins seems to have become Bernard the Hermit. It must be possible to criticise Parliament. It must be possible to criticise members of Parliament. We must not allow Parliament to use its powers to clamp down on opposition. No one likes being criticised, but it is fundamental to free speech to be able to criticise politicians. Frankly, if you don't like being criticised, you shouldn't be a politician. As always, I want to hear from you. Let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. But I'm delighted to be joined by my panel, senior GB News political commentator Nigel Nelson, Daily Telegraph columnist Madeline Grant, and I'm afraid on tardy book, Stephen Pound, but we'll see if he gets there. Nigel, you think the committee is reasonable to clamp down on criticism?
Well, I find the free speech argument you're putting up really rather peculiar. I mean, the whole point was the committee were doing an investigation, and I'm assuming that you don't think you were part of a coordinated campaign to undermine the committee.
I wasn't.
Do you think the other MPs were who were named in it?
You have to ask them. I have no idea whether there was any coordination, but they haven't established this in their report. They've just asserted it.
But sticking with the free speech argument, that we don't have free speech if a trial is taking place, and we have sub judice laws. When an investigation is going on, it's a parliamentary procedure, and I would have thought that you, of all people, would love parliamentary procedure and the sovereignty of Parliament, and on the basis of that, it shouldn't be criticised while it is actually happening.
But they're not like a jury. A jury is to protect individual members of the public who are never in the public limelight. The job of politicians is to be criticised, and when we say things in Parliament that are controversial, when we do things in Parliament that are controversial, they must be challenged by a free press and by other members of Parliament.
But there are rules in Parliament that you abide by. You can't call an MP a liar.
I can out of Parliament.
You can out of Parliament.
But they're saying I can't criticise them out of Parliament, let alone in Parliament.
No, but the point I'm making is there are rules in Parliament, like not being able to call an MP a liar. On the basis of that, I presume that you would follow that rule. If a select committee, a privileges committee, is having an investigation, that surely, before the criticism happens, you should let them investigate, come out with a final result, which Parliament can either accept or reject, and then criticise.
Madeline, I just think Nigel's wrong on this, that if you think the chairman of a committee is partial and has said things that prejudge the issue, you must be able to say that prior to the committee concluding, otherwise it's too late.
I just think it's quite difficult to make the point that this is a kind of a committee with a quasi-judicial role and then not expect that it apply to the rules that would apply to a court of law, such as that the chair of the committee is on the record saying that they believe in Boris Johnson's guilt before they've even begun their deliberations, does not recuse themselves. As Chris Bryant, of all people, he knew full well that that was the right thing to do, and he did that. And, of course, your point earlier about Bernard Jenkin. I mean, if this were a true court of law proceedings, it would have been thrown out and they'd have to have started all over again. And I say this as someone who thinks that Boris Johnson deserved to be punished and that this was all a problem of his own making, but that all the same, the committee has overreached itself here.
And Nigel seems to want them to be able to have it both ways, that they don't have to follow the rules of a court, but they get the protections of a criminal jury trial. That can't be reasonable. They must have it one way or the other.
Precisely. And I thought that the language of the report today I actually found quite amusing, because it was essentially saying you're not allowed to criticise us or else how dare you, but also at the same time wrapping it up in this incredibly loyally grandiose language. It was simultaneously very childish and also very pompous at the same time.
And delighted to have Stephen with us. I think you've been stopped by Sadiq Khan getting here on time.
Actually, Sir Jacob, it was a swan. A swan on the line twixt West Drayton and Reading.
So we blame the King because they belong to him.
Indeed. I don't believe he eats them anymore, though.
You're a great parliamentarian. You loved Parliament when you were there. You believe in its processes. Do you think privileges committees overreached, or we should all kowtow to it?
No, there's no question of kowtow. Nobody kowtows everybody. Parliament had the opportunity to actually sign off on this or to throw it back in their faces. If Parliament chose not to, a great many distinguished parliamentarians chose to endorse the decision of the 5-person committee, of which only 2 were actually Labour people. But I think there's a separate issue there. I think that the pursuit of some people, including yourself, if I may say so, for in any way being critical of this committee, that is irrelevant and impertinent in many ways, and I do not support or endorse that. But I have to say, the view of the committee, I think, is inviolable. It stands.
So you're with Madeleine on thinking that the view of the committee is fair, but you're not with Nigel. Come back to you, Nigel, because there's one thing in this report that's very odd. It says that MPs are entitled to debate, vote and comment publicly on the committee's final report once it's published and the investigation is completed, paragraph 8. Then you turn to paragraph 15, when it criticises my challenging in that very debate Harriet Harman for being not impartial. Now, I can't have it both ways. They seem to be saying not only can you not criticise its establishment and its operation, but you can't criticise its result unless you do it in a way the committee likes. This is bonkers, isn't it?
Well, I mean, you were then criticising the chair,
yes,
who had been appointed and approved by MPs, by Parliament. But that committee was not something that they sought out.
This is lunatic. The Prime Minister is appointed by MPs. Are you saying that we can't criticise the Prime Minister? Are you saying we can't criticise the Speaker?
But what we're talking about is a quasi-judicial process. We're talking about...
But it didn't follow those rules.
Well, not entirely, no, I agree. But I mean, this is Parliament. Parliament is sovereign.
But it's always the High Court of Parliament. So who can we criticise, Matt?
This is the point. I mean, Parliament is sovereign, but does that mean that no MP is allowed to express their reservations and therefore be potentially... I mean, according to the logic of the previous 2 reports, there will now have to be a 3rd report into all those MPs who criticise the report into the report. You know, this could go on forever.
I hope that I'm allowed to criticise this report on the basis that you are allowed to say things once it's completed. Except they don't like it then when I do.
Would you apologise for saying that...
Am I?
Yeah, of course you have.
Comparing it to a kangaroo court, for instance.
No.
You wouldn't apologise for that?
No. I think this was not a properly run privileges committee.
So, Jacob, could I say something that gives me actually some pain to actually say this? I really think we should stand back and see the broader picture here. And I think this is like, what's his name, Soshi Yokai, who didn't believe that the emperor was immortal and carried on fighting in Guam until 1977. Look, Johnson is gone. He's the living personification of the upas tree. You know, he poisons everyone who comes close to him. He's gone. He's finished. That ship has sailed. Let's move on. It is people like you, it is the future of the Conservative Party that really matter here. Boris Johnson is finished. And the Scott Nat on the committee, a number of his colleagues said they would love to have seen Johnson remaining. He was the best electoral asset the Scots Nats had, and maybe some people in the Labour Party said that. But look, let's please move on. It's over. It's done.
Now Stephen said I'm the future of the Conservative Party. He's forgiven
I sincerely hope
for
you
being
are.
late. It's almost as good as Geoffrey Boycott saying I should be Prime Minister 48 hours ago on GBNews, on Nigel's show. Nigel, I want to come back to you because you're keen to defend the committee. Surely, fundamentally, Parliament trying to go back to 18th century prerogatives and privileges makes Parliament look silly. It doesn't make it look strong.
But the point that the committee is making is that they're accusing you, which you obviously have just denied, of a coordinated attempt to undermine the investigation. And the worst part of that report is to say, if this sort of thing persists, they will have to think about moving these kind of disciplinary hearings outside Parliament. And you, as a believer in parliamentary sovereignty, surely would want to keep that within Parliament.
I believe in democracy, but thank you to my panel. Don't forget to let me know what you think, mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, the Court of Appeal has overturned the High Court's Rwanda ruling. Is this just a case of political judges overruling democratic mandates? Plus, I'll be introducing a new segment, Jacob's Book Club. This week, we'll be discussing with author Edward Chancellor, is the Bank of England useless?
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Susan says, the members of the Privileges Committee are privileged to be members. Unfortunately, they are abusing this privilege. So disappointing that the Privilege Committee makes Parliament look foolish. You will be fine, Jacob. Common sense must prevail. I'd be careful, Susan. They might have you up in front of them. Pat says, Jacob, please tell Nigel Nelson that even the Pope isn't infallible. We may come on to that on another occasion. So MPs must be able to criticise the committee if they believe they are wrong. The alternative is terrifying. I could give a brief talk on Vatican I and the papal infallibility, but perhaps not tonight.
Infallibility in matters of doctrine.
Ant says, what is the point of parliamentary democracy when an elected government cannot protect our borders? What is the point of Parliament when free speech is no longer allowed? And what's the point of living in a civil society when pressure groups can effectively close down not only free speech, but people's livelihoods. Rishi Sunak has faced another setback in his pledge to curb illegal migration. As the good plan to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda for claims processing is ruled unlawful by the appeal court, who decided Rwanda is not a safe third country, not because it's not safe itself, but because people might be moved on from Rwanda to another country. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has said she remains fully committed to the Rwanda policy and was disappointed with the Court of Appeal's decision. And the Prime Minister has said he will challenge the latest legal blow by taking it to the Supreme Court, saying that he fundamentally disagrees with the ruling. Mr Sunak has made tackling illegal migration a flagship focus of his premiership and seems determined to fight to the end. Can he retain the public's confidence following this setback? I'm now joined once again by my panel, former Labour MP Stephen Pound, GB News senior political commentator Nigel Nelson, and the Daily Telegraph columnist Madeleine McCann. Madeleine McCann. Madeleine Grant. We got a name right in the end.
Good Lord.
Would you like my copy of the Telegraph?
Thank you. Thank you for coming on. But is this a real setback for the government? Do you think the Court of Appeal is right?
Well, I think it's an enormous setback for the government, actually, because at the beginning of the year, Rishi Sunak made his 5 pledges or his 5 missions, and he basically tethered himself politically to this, along with 4 other issues. And I think there was perhaps a very narrow path to success for him, which involved saying, I'm not Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, I'm a kind of quiet, unshowy bloke who gets on with things, and I beaver away and I quietly get things done.
Quite Starmer-like.
Exactly. I mean, perhaps elements of that. Of course, Starmer hasn't had his chance yet. We'll have to see what happens there. But in this case, I think that evaporating, it's just it torpedoes absolutely everything that he was attempting to campaign on. And I don't buy this idea that some people have, that it's a kind of, they'll simply be able to blame this on lefty lawyers and obstructionists. It ultimately looks like the government is not able to achieve what it promised to do. And whoever's fault that is, it just will look like incompetence.
The government is capable of achieving it, but not this way. The Israelis tried it. They sent 4,000 people to Rwanda. Rwanda is the upper Congo. It's on the great divide between the Nile and the Congo. It's a place which is very, very dangerous. It's been in continuous war of one sort or another since the 1840s. It's a nonsense to suggest that it's a safe place. We've actually got people in this country today seeking asylum from Rwanda. Look, the answer is look at what the Dutch are doing. The Dutch simply do the most overcrowded country in Europe, and they have a huge problem with their former empire, with people coming here from Suriname and various other places. What they do is they do not let people beyond the precincts of the ports, the harbours or the airports. They process them there and then. Our Home Office is sclerotic and incompetent. Okay, we need to process them, and if they are coming from Albania or somewhere safe, back they go. Nigel, if they're from Afghanistan, we actually process it, and hopefully we actually respect their rights.
Nigel, however inefficient or efficient the Home Office is, if the courts won't let them send people away, there's nothing we can do, and that seems to be the problem. Whatever the government does, it gets ruled impossible by the courts.
Well, I mean, a situation like this, we all thought that was going to happen. I mean, I always doubted whether a single plane would ever take off for Rwanda. And what the Court of Appeal has done today is reinforce that idea. I mean, this was a bad idea right from the start. That if the government had done what they should be doing, which is actually dealing with the asylum crisis at source, so cutting the backlogs for a start, if we send them to Rwanda under their own figures, £169,000 per person, we could keep someone in a hotel for 3.5 years for that kind of money.
But it's about deterrence, isn't it? The £169,000 is not that we'll send lots and lots of people, it's that people will stop coming, as the Albanians have seemed to have done.
Well, I mean,
the Albanians, once they knew they'd go back to Albania, seem to have stopped coming. That seems to be quite a success.
Because we have a returns agreement, which is the other thing we should be doing. We lost all the returns agreements with Europe.
They never worked.
Well, then they ought to be working better. And we at least were able to send people back to France for a start. I think that in 1919 it was more than 50 people we were able to send back to France under the EU, under Dublin. Yeah, indeed. We've lost that. And the final thing is, why do we insist on processing asylum seekers within this country? That becomes a magnet for them crossing the channel.
Well, we're suggesting processing them in Rwanda. That's the whole point of Rwanda. But they
stay in Rwanda, they don't come back here.
That's right. Surely that's reasonable. Rwanda is a safe country. The Court of Appeal hasn't said Rwanda's dangerous.
I think the UNHCR also decided deemed Rwanda a safe third country themselves. And of course, the High Court came to a different conclusion. But I mean, I really don't know enough to comment on the legality of this. But I think it's a very difficult situation situation where something the public cares about very deeply cannot be resolved through politics and is seen not to work.
Well, isn't the problem that judges seem to replace political judgment with their judgment? That the Home Secretary thinks it's safe, the Prime Minister thinks it's safe, the High Court, the UNHCR thinks it's safe, but we've then got a group of judges who basically make a political decision on the legal decision.
No, they make a legal decision. They're saying that this is unlawful, which is a decision for the judiciary. They're there to interpret the laws that you make.
Yeah, but they're saying it's unlawful because they don't think it's safe, whereas the politicians think it's safe. Surely the safety is a political decision. Madeline?
Well, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy with that. I haven't had a chance to look at this in great detail, but, you know, it's a really problematic thing where you have decisions. It feels to people as if big decisions are being taken in an opaque way, where often the reason behind it, the rationale behind it, is not revealed at the time. I'm thinking also of when at the very last minute there was a last-minute legal challenge that prevented the first of those flights leaving. I think that was at the end of last year. And again, it led to great confusion about why that decision had been taken, and there was very little clarity at the time on that.
And that's the problem. There's a feeling of powerlessness, that you elect a government promises to do something, can't do it because human rights gets in the way.
Well, no. The law is absolutely crucial. It's basically the last refuge of the strength of the individual. I honestly think
Parliament passed a law to make this happen, and Parliament's law is being ignored. That seems to be a problem.
If Parliament passes a law to say that everybody's going to walk on their hands and speak Turkish, I mean, it's not going to happen.
No, but if they pass a law saying it is legitimate to send people to Rwanda, surely that's the law of the land.
Hang on a second. The High Court, the judges took evidence from a whole range of people, 27 different NGOs and people who'd actually been there, former Foreign Office staff, diplomats, people who knew, and from Paul Kagame and various other people in country. Their conclusion was, at the end, dispassionately, leaving aside the emotion, and you're right to say that this is an incredibly emotional issue, leaving aside all of that, their cool determination was, this makes no sense. And it makes no sense financially, it makes no sense morally, and above all, it makes no sense in terms of efficiency, because are we honestly suggesting we fly somebody there and then bring them back again? I mean, it's insane. We should be processing in country, and if a person is coming from Afghanistan and we can't send them back to Afghanistan, we should consider that on grounds of humanity and humanely. If they're coming from Albania, I'll put them in the boot of my car and drive them there myself.
Madeline, put them in the boot of the car. What are you going to do?
Well, it strikes me that if the judges are there to make deliberations on whether a policy is, even practical, that may be their view, but is it really their choice to say whether it's a good or bad idea? I mean, yes, this does look like another case of overreach.
Thank you very much to my panel. Coming up, it's the latest edition to State of the Nation's collection of segments, Jacob's Book Club. Edward Chancellor is going to be here to help answer the question, have central banks been bungling for decades? And don't forget, is it right that a bank can suspend your account because it doesn't agree with what you do?
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com. You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Gary says, Jacob, it shows how out of touch these judges are. The United Nations themselves deem Rwanda to be a safe country. Also, other countries send people to Rwanda. So how can our judges recommend that it's unsafe and unlawful? Ian says, my own concern regarding Rwanda is that it's an unstable country. They had an horrific ethnic massacre following mass immigration. Need I continue? And Barry, what kind of a useless government do we have? I thought that the government makes the laws of the country. If so, why does it need to refer to the Supreme Court at every turn whenever activists try to thwart government decisions? It's an important point because we say Parliament is sovereign, but our laws seem to be overturned by the judges regularly. Now, it is with great pleasure that we can introduce State of the Nation's latest edition, the Jacob Rees-Mogg Book Club. Well, today I'm very pleased to be joined by Edward Chancellor, a respected financial writer and the author of the book The Price of Time, The Real Story of Interest, to mention a few, but this was most recently published. It discusses why zero interest rates were a mistake and the widespread misconception among individuals that money can be obtained practically for free. As we discovered last night, the Bank of England's hokey-cokey with interest rates has real consequences as the United Kingdom's largest water utility now teeters on the verge of bankruptcy because of its £14 billion of debt, which it acquired when interest rates were near zero. Like many other corporations, Thames Water is grappling with rising interest rates and higher payments, even though its underlying business is as sound as it ever was. Indeed, these developments underscore the importance of understanding, with Mr. Chancellor's enlightening work shedding light on the complexities of monetary policy. Edward, thank you so much for joining me. Your book's fantastic because it goes back to interest rates in Babylonian times, which many of us didn't know anything about, and works all the way through. And in the whole history of interest rates, they'd never previously been zero.
No, that's true. So we've got 5 millennia of history, and what's interesting is that you get interest appearing before you even have money. You have interest on loans of grain and on loans of silver blocks. And coinage is not invented to millennia later. So there is this phenomenon that seems to be around all of human existence. And then suddenly, in the last decade, the central banks thought, OK, we can take it down to zero because we're worried about deflation. But it had never been so low. And I wrote this book to try and discover what interest was, why it existed. And I think it exists because we're mortal. We don't live very long. Our resources are scarce. Some people have resources, other people want to use them, and they pay for the use of the resources. And then the aim of the book was then, after understanding what interest was, that to see what had happened when we took rates to zero. And in my view, on a number of fronts, it was a disaster. The creation of these asset price bubbles, too much risk being taken in the financial system. And, you just mentioned Thames Water. That's a classic example of a company that was completely financially engineered. So, I mean, you say that its business was sound. Well, I mean, from what one reads, it seems to be a lot of it's not actually concentrating on its core business, but on its financial engineering, borrowing huge amounts of money and using that money to pay out shareholders.
I think it's a really good example to explain what you go through in the book, because it makes £1.1 billion of EBITDA in its last financial year on the business of providing water and dealing with sewage. That is a business that has a pretty much guaranteed top line. You can't not pay for it. Everybody has to pay for it. The money flows.
And the regulator guarantees it.
That's right. They then used that to take on £14 billion worth of debt to give to themselves and to their shareholders. Bit of investment.
Well, acquired, by foreign investors for that purpose.
Because the debt was free. And then they discovered that it doesn't remain free and they're bankrupt.
Yeah, so Jay, we've got this on a number of fronts. We mentioned this. We can talk about the companies that have been gearing themselves up, taking on leverage in order to increase the returns to shareholders. But obviously, the other thing in the news recently has been the mortgage crisis. Because people were buying houses at inflated levels. So we're paying, relative to our income, more than twice what we were paying at the turn of the century. And we've taken on, I think, roughly 3 times more debt relative to our income than used to be the case. So each household is in its way a mini Thames Water and suffering in the same way.
So zero interest rates allowed people to ratchet up asset value. So Thames Water, 1.1 billion of earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortisation. An individual was in a similar position, could buy a house for £1 million and at 1% pay £10,000 a year. Now that's gone up to £60,000 a year of interest. That's quite a shock to the system.
Yeah, and I think we are, I think in terms of, the mortgage costs as a share of income, we're at the same position as British households were in 1889 at the end of the Lawson housing boom. And if you remember, after that, we had quite a steep housing bust with millions of houses, as far as I remember, in negative equity and so forth.
And why do you think central banks globally, because it's not just the Bank of England, indeed it may be primarily the Federal Reserve in the United States, got into this position of wanting zero interest rates?
So my argument in the book is that interest is the most important price in the market system, affecting valuations, risk, amount of your returns on investment, and so forth. But the policymakers had a very narrow view of interest. They thought interest was only about controlling inflation, and as for various reasons, there was low inflation after the financial crisis, in part because China was selling cheap stuff to the developed world, in part because of the aftermath of the crisis itself, which in turn, and we forget, was in part caused by the low interest rates in the early 2000s. So we've just continued down a road that initially led us into a crisis, and then not learning the lesson from that, we went further down the road.
Was it essentially a hubris of central banks that they thought they could not smooth out the economic cycle, they could just ensure the economic cycle always gently rose, and they produced more and more money to try and keep this going at lower and lower prices? And eventually that became inflationary and they had to change tack.
Well, I think what's hubristic was that first of all, they credited themselves with the low inflation. And then because there was low inflation, they thought it didn't matter keeping interest rates low and then, and printing, in the Bank of England's case, but acquiring securities to the tune of, £850 billion. And they thought that the expansion of the money supply, it didn't matter, it wasn't going to lead to inflation, and the man on the street was thinking, there is going to be inflation. Almost everyone knew that inflation was coming, apart from the central banks, and it's not just Bank of England, you say, but everyone else. And actually, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, at least had the good grace last year to say, we're beginning to know how little we know about inflation. From my perspective, it would be nice also if they acknowledged how little they understood about the nature of interest rates and the corruption of the economies and of the financial system caused by these ultra-low rates.
From your history, is there a right rate of interest?
I think I told you earlier once that the Spanish Salamancan school in medieval Europe apparently declared that the true rate of interest was known only to God. I think there would be a proper rate, a fair rate of interest, if it were discovered in the market, like most other prices of most other goods and services. The trouble is that if you can live in a world where money is conjured up, in the world we live in, of central banks printing money and banks themselves creating money through their acts of lending, it's very difficult to get actually a market price. Now, your father was an advocate, I think, of the gold standard,
was, yes.
and therefore, under a gold standard, you would go back to something closer to a market price and therefore a natural price.
Well, thank you very much. I would say that Edward's book was the best book I read last year, the most informative and insightful. So thank you, Edward, for coming on. He's going back to Somerset later, all the best people do. Coming up, Nigel Farage reveals he's been cancelled by his own bank, and we found a group who had suffered similarly.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Weeknights on GB News from 6 p.m. You'll always get drama.
Please stop, Michelle.
I know, yeah.
Please stop.
Should I just shut up?
Romance.
You like me, I like you. There you go.
There you are. Well, don't tell anybody.
Adventure.
Etc.
That's the whole point. But
and action.
Sergeant Reed, my superstar panel, they're already at it. They're fighting. It's going to be quite a show.
Only on GB News. Britain's watching.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Jake says, trafficking vulnerable people to Rwanda is a disgusting policy, and subcontracting our responsibilities does nothing for the UK's reputation. Once again, Britannia waives the rules. Paul says, hi, Jacob. Very good show as always. Thank you, Paul. Position and privilege should never determine favour when equity is essential for a just outcome. If something isn't right in the process, then for equity's sake and a just outcome, it must be addressed as soon as it's recognised. And Keith says if someone is to be denied a bank account, the onus should be on the bank to make it clear why and be prepared on demand to substantiate their decision with evidence. And in the event that that decision is not accepted, the case should go to the Ombudsman. That sounds very fair and reasonable to me, because corporate censorship does seem to be on the rise, and there seems to be a recurring theme, the stifling of freedom of speech. In 2020, the Core Issues Trust, a non-profit Christian ministry, had its business account closed by Barclays after LGBTQ+ activists accused the charity of conducting the banned practice of conversion therapy. The Core Issues Trust helps people who struggle with their inner self in a religious context. Following this, the organisation's chief executive, Dr. Mike Davidson, received death threats against his family members. After a 3-year-long fight, Barclays has paid £20,000 in compensation to the charity on the grounds of discrimination. The channel previously covered the thwarting of free speech when friend of the channel, Director General of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young, had his PayPal account shut down after the organisation claimed the Free Speech Union had breached their, quote, acceptable terms policy, unquote. And yes, the acceptable terms policy of offering a different opinion to the blob. Should banks have the right to suspend an account for an opinion they may not necessarily agree with? Well, I'm now joined by the Chief Executive of Core Issues Trust, Dr. Mike Davidson. Mike, thank you for coming in. So,
welcome.
What happened? Barclays just suddenly said to you to bank with some time, your account's been closed.
Just received a letter, I have to say, after a sustained period of pressure from LGBT activists who were phoning, I think some 300 phone calls over a couple of days, a vast amount of material sent in our direction that we really wouldn't want. The evidence is there on social media, and what had happened was Barclays came under scrutiny, were accused of supporting a so-called conversion therapy outfit, and the result was that they closed the account. We simply received letters saying that the account is closed, and will close.
They were going to do that in spite of the fact that you weren't breaking the law, you were operating within the law and within your religious principles.
I think, you know, at the very least, I would have expected Barclays to give us a call and say, what's going on? What are you doing? Could you give us some reassurance that you're not breaking the law? Help us to understand what the heart of it is that you are doing. But there was nothing of that. The day I received the letters, I phoned Barclays, asked them why, and they simply said, we're not obliged to give you a reason.
And that seems very unfair, because Nigel Farage is finding the same thing, that he won't get any reason for why a bank is trying to close his account. And as one of the Rees-Mogg said, the onus ought to be on the bank to explain why it's doing it, so you can challenge their reasoning.
That's absolutely the case. If we'd had that, I think we could have put forward a good case. We could show that we are accountable, that we are seeking to be professional, that we are aware of the controversies, and that we are not over-promising or we're not forcing people in any way, but we are simply facilitating the right and freedom of therapeutic and counselling choice.
And you had people who were protesting against you, so it was very much Barclays giving in to pressure from an outside group, rather than anything arising in your accounts that gave Barclays any reason to think anything untoward was going on.
That's exactly correct.
And so people who didn't like you were able to set the pace.
And not only Barclays Bank, it was also MailChimp that was lost permanently. It was also TikTok. It was all of our social media accounts on Facebook, PayPal, and no amount of appeal, even some material from YouTube taken down, no appeal was successful.
So you're still not on PayPal? You can't get back onto them?
No, can't get back
So
on.
they are anti-free speech as an organisation?
And so is MailChimp for the same reason.
OK, and so is MailChimp. Barclays has given you compensation. Are you now banking with them, or have you got to bank with somebody else?
We've banked with somebody else, but one of our organisations, the International Federation for Therapeutic and Counselling Choice, registered in Great Britain, in England, has been denied accounts, and in other banks as well. It's the same situation. We just cannot get a bank account at the moment.
You can't get a bank account at the moment. So even though Barclays has paid you compensation, you're not able to bank with them?
No, we're not allowed to bank with them. They have not apologised. They've not made any admission of guilt, and they've certainly not reactivated either accounts. It was Core Issues Trust and the IFTCC. We now have in another banking institution a community account for which we're grateful, but the IFTCC remains bankless.
And do you know how widespread a problem this is? Because we're finding out about it anecdotally, that we had the issue with the Free Speech Union, we've got the issue with Nigel Farage, we've got the issue with you. Do you know of other organisations that have been similarly affected?
I certainly do. I know that Christian Concern, for example, lost their MailChimp account at one point, and I think they were successful. It seems the larger organisations who can demonstrate a more significant following than we could are more successful. I think LifeSite News is another one that at one point lost their MailChimp account. So I think it is definitely going on.
And it seems to be very much a free speech issue, that if they don't like the views that you hold, then they come along and close you down. They don't close you down if you go along with sort of woke modern views.
From my point of view, what we have in the United Kingdom at the moment is a kind of monoculture. And if you venture out of that, this is the result. So we've lost this ideological diversity from which you would think there would be checks and balances. The basis, I would think, of true critique and of democracy. Now it seems that one viewpoint is, judge, jury, executioner. If I take my own circumstance, I was put out of the British Psychodrama Association for my views around homosexuality.
OK. Well, Barclays has given a response and made a comment. There has been no admission of liability by Barclays, and there's been no decision by the court calling into question Barclays' actions, including Barclays' decision to exit its relationship with Core Issues Trust and IFTCC. Barclays remains an advocate for the equality and dignity of all members of society, including the LGBT+ community, and our stance on this matter affirms this position. It's always very odd to pay out tens of thousands of pounds and not admit liability. So I'm not really convinced by that, Barclays, but thank you for replying. And if you want to come on the programme, Mr. Barclays Chairman, I'd be delighted. But that's all from me. It's Professor Daniel Wootton next. Daniel, are your bank accounts suspended yet?
Do you know what? This has happened to me previously. Actually, I was just talking to Nigel before the show. It happened to me with HSBC. So I think it's absolutely brilliant that he has called out something that has been going on with people on the right for some time. Anne Widdecombe's going to be reacting to that on the show tonight. Also, Jacob, I know you're very interested. Who is going to be the Conservative candidate for the London mayoralty? Well, we've had Susan Hall on already. Tonight, Moz Hussain puts his case, of course, with Korski pulling out, it's down to the final two.
Mind you, some people are saying it should be reopened, and perhaps, Dan, you might be a candidate. But that's all coming up after the weather. I'll be back on Monday at 8 o'clock. This has been State of the Nation, and I'm sure the weather is going to be marvellous in Somerset all weekend, and I hope at Lord's too.
Hello there, welcome to your GB News weather forecast from the Met Office. I'm Craig Snell. We're looking ahead to the next few days. It's going to remain pretty changeable. Some rain, also some showers, but for northern areas it turns increasingly windy, and it's all down to its area of low pressure. As we go through the next few days, that will edge its way closer towards the UK. But high pressure always close to the south, so here more in the way of dry weather than wet weather compared to the north. So as we end Thursday, for most of us, we end on a fairly clear and dry note. But as we go into Friday, we start to see thicker cloud and outbreaks of rain spread its way into many western districts of the country. But for most, it's going to be a fairly mild night, maybe a little bit fresher than recently, but for many, temperatures staying in double figures. So we start off Friday with some sunshine across many central and eastern parts of the country, but the cloud and rain across the west will spread its way eastwards as we go through the course of the day. May hang on to some brightness for a good chunk of the day for East Anglia and South East England. So where this does occur, it will still feel pretty warm, but elsewhere maybe a little bit cooler than recently. And the most persistent rain really reserved for Northern Ireland and parts of Scotland. Into the evening.